Good afternoon, folks. Welcome back to the channel. I've named the debacle downtown transpiring at present here in Ottawa Canada's Versailles moment. You know, I'm constantly remembered why it is vital to study history, because nothing that is transpiring today hasn't had something similar transpire in the past. So I'm going to speak with you today about what is similar with this moment in time right now. Canada's Louis the XVI moment. And here's a quote from Dr. David Starkey, given on the Brendan O'Neill show. "All bad ideas are French. It's an absolute principle of human existence." For over a century, the Palace of Versailles was home to the most powerful family in Europe, a place of artistry which bred lavish entertainment, passionate love affairs, and outrageous scandals. While a lucky few danced, feasted, and flirted their days away, the state was on the brink of collapse. Outside those gilded gates, millions of ordinary people were taxed to the hilt, while rich nobles paid virtually nothing. A new king, Louis the XVI, and his beautiful young wife, Queen Marie Antoinette, faced the biggest challenge in the history of their illustrious families: to bring fairness to the system and hope to their subjects, or face losing their palace, their crowns, and their heads. In 1775, Versailles celebrated the coronation of the new king and queen. Louis the XVI had lived most of his 20 years there, surrounded by courtiers and power brokers. But like his young Austrian wife, Maria Antoinette, he didn't feel ready to rule. Despite the king's private feelings, the public had high hopes, as he was young and had a beautiful wife. So there's everything to expect from this new and hopefully glorious reign of Louis the XVI. Louis the XVI wanted to rule in the grand manner. He wanted to be an absolute monarch. He wanted to live up to the style of Louis the Great or Louis the XIV, but interestingly, also wanted to rule in a manner which would be popular. To be truly popular, Louis knew that he had to govern in the interests of all his people, and not just the ones he had grown up with. So, in keeping with the Age of Enlightenment, he intended to be a slightly more modern king. He had ambitions to be a just and philanthropic monarch, and he called himself Louis le Bienfaisant, or Louis the Beneficent. In fact, one of his first decisions was so modern that it quite terrified his courtiers. He had his whole family inoculated against smallpox, using a procedure that was experimental and very dangerous. This was something which raised hairs at the time, and people thought, what happens if he dies? What would happen if he dies? And that way the king took the lead. He showed that he could lead with the times and move with the times. And that was a promising start to his reign. A promising start, yes. But the end wasn't so promising, unless losing one head was the promise one hoped to fulfill. Before the Revolution, French society was divided into three orders, or estates of the realm. The first estate was the clergy. The second estate was the nobility. And the third estate was the commoners. With around 27 million people, or 98% of France's population, the third estate was by far the largest of the three. Despite this, it was politically invisible, unrepresented in, and wielding no influence on the government. Diversity in the third estate. As it might be expected in such a sizable group, the third estate boasted considerable diversity. There were many different classes and levels of wealth, different professions and ideas, rural, provincial, and urban residents alike. Members of the Third Estate ranged from lowly beggars and struggling peasants to urban artisans and laborers, from the shopkeepers and commercial middle class to the nation's wealthiest merchants and capitalists. Despite the Third Estate's enormous size and economic importance, it played almost no role in the government or decision-making of the Ancien regime. The frustrations, grievances, and suffering of the Third Estate became the pivotal cause of the French Revolution. The peasantry. Peasants inhabited the bottom tier of the Third Estate social hierarchy, comprising 82 to 89% of the population. Peasant farmers were the nation's poorest social class. While levels of wealth and income varied, it is reasonable to suggest that most French peasants were poor. A very small percentage of peasants owned land in their own right and were able to live independently as yeoman farmers. The vast majority, however, were either feudal tenants, métayers, that is a tenant sharecropper who worked someone else's land, or journaliers, day laborers who sought work where they could find it. Whatever their personal situation, all peasants were heavily taxed by the state. If they were feudal tenants, peasants were required to pay dues to their local seigneur or lord. And by the way, the seigneurial system was a part of Quebec. At the time when it was first founded, it was known as, it was New France. And then after the British conquest of the French in Quebec City, it was known as Lower Canada. If they belonged to a parish, as most did, they were expected to pay an annual tithe to the church. These obligations were seldom relaxed, even during difficult times such as poor harvests, when many peasants were pushed to the brink of starvation. Urban commoners. Other members of the Third Estate lived and worked in French towns and cities. While the 18th century was a period of industrial and urban growth in France, most cities remained comparatively small. There were only 9 French cities with a population exceeding 50,000 people. Paris, with around 650,000, was by far the largest. Most commoners in the towns and cities made a living as merchants, skilled artisans, or unskilled workers. Artisans worked in industries like textiles and clothing manufacture, upholstery and furniture, clockmaking, locksmithing, leather goods, carriage making and repair, carpentry, and masonry. A few artisans operated their own businesses, but most worked for large firms or employers. Before doing business or gaining employment, an artisan had to belong to a guild that managed and regulated his particular industry. Unskilled laborers worked as servants, cleaners, hauliers, water carriers, washerwomen, hawkers, in short, anything that did not require training or a membership of a guild. Many Parisians, perhaps as many as 80,000 people, had no job at all. They survived by begging, scavenging, petty crime, or prostitution. The difficult 1780s. The lives of urban workers became increasingly difficult in the 1780s. Parisian workers toiled for meager wages, between 30 and 60 sous a day for skilled labor and 15 to 20 sous a day for the unskilled. Wages rose by around 20% in the 25 years before 1789. However, prices and rents increased by 60% in the same period. The poor harvests of 1788 and 89 pushed Parisian workers to the brink by driving up bread prices. Early in 1789, the price of a 4-pound loaf of bread in Paris increased from 9 sous to 14.5 sous, almost a full day's pay for most unskilled laborers. Low pay and high food prices were compounded. My gosh, this sounds like it's going to be this bad in Europe this year, this fall, I can tell you. Compounded by miserable living conditions in Paris. Accommodations in the capital were so scarce that workers and their families crammed into shared attics and dirty tenements, most rented from unscrupulous landlords. With rents running at several sous a day, most workers economized by sharing accommodation. Many rooms housed between 6 and 10 people, though 12 to 15 per room was not unknown. Conditions in the tenements were cramped, unhygienic, and uncomfortable. There was no heating, plumbing, or common ablutions. The toilet facilities were usually an outside cesspit or open sewer, while water was fetched by hand from communal wells. Not all members of the Third Estate were impoverished, though. At the apex of the Third Estate social hierarchy was a bourgeoisie or capitalist middle class. The bourgeoisie were business owners and professionals with enough wealth to live comfortably. As with the peasantry, there was also diversity within their ranks. There was the petty bourgeoisie. The petty or small bourgeoisie were small-scale traders, landlords, shopkeepers, and managers. The haute bourgeoisie were wealthy merchants and traders, colonial landholders, industrialists, bankers, and financiers, tax farmers, and trained professionals such as doctors and lawyers. The bourgeoisie flourished during the 1700s, due in part to France's economic growth, modernization, increased production, imperial expansion, and foreign trade. The haute bourgeoisie rose from the middle classes to become independently wealthy, well-educated, and ambitious. Political aspirations. As their wealth increased, so did their desire for social status and political representation. Many bourgeoisie craved entry into the Second Estate. They wanted to become nobles. They had money to acquire the costumes and grand residences of the noble class, but lacked their titles, privileges, and prestige. A system of venality evolved that allowed the wealthiest of the bourgeoisie to buy their way into the nobility. Though by the 1780s, this was becoming more difficult and frightfully expensive. The thwarted social and political ambitions of the bourgeoisie led to considerable frustration. The haute bourgeoisie had become the economic masters of the nation, yet government and policy remained the domain of the royalty and their noble favorites. The revolutionary bourgeoisie. Many educated bourgeoisie found solace in Enlightenment tracts, which challenged the foundation of monarchical power and argued the government should be representative, accountable, and based on popular sovereignty. While Emmanuel Sayes published What is the Third Estate in January 1789, it struck a chord with the self-important bourgeoisie, many of whom believed themselves entitled to a hand in government. What is the Third Estate was not only expression of this idea. There was a flood of similar pamphlets and essays around the nation in early 1789. When these documents spoke of the Third Estate, however, they referred chiefly to the bourgeoisie, not to France's 22 million rural peasants, landless laborers, or urban workers. When the bourgeoisie dreamed of representative government, it was a government that represented the propertied classes only. The peasants and urban workers were politically invisible to the bourgeoisie, just as the bourgeoisie itself was politically invisible to the Ancien Regime. So, Louis the XVI hated the English so much that because of the Age of Enlightenment and America's disgust with the fact that there was no representation by population and no taxation and demanded that there be no taxation without representation, and all their petitions had fallen on deaf ears in Britain, the revolutionaries had gone to France and to ask that Louis the XVI fund the American Revolution. Because France was broke, he borrowed the money to help fund the American Revolution, which only exacerbated the economic woes of France. Then he was told by those who were responsible to advise the king on economic matters that he should get into stimulus spending and quantitative easing, which again made the situation very much worse. Then the king was left with the only option of beginning to tax the nobility, of taxing the second estate. This is something they absolutely wouldn't tolerate because they weren't about to forgo their privilege. So, of course, then the taxation devolved to the third estate, to the common person. And it became so intolerable that they formed a national assembly and demanded that a constitution be written in which the wealthier members of the third estate, the bourgeoisie, would have representative government under constitutional law. Everything goes full circle. What happened in the end? The king couldn't listen, but he wasn't willing to do what Trudeau did and unleash his own military, police, quasi-military, on his own citizens. So the citizens arrested the king, and of course a reign of terror ensued. It's absolutely astounding to me that all of these things are so predictable, and all we're hearing from these hearings downtown regarding how Trudeau could have thought that he had met the very high bar necessary to invoke the Emergency Measures Act, martial law, in the nation's capital, how that high bar was met. Every indication, first of all, the police are no longer operating at arm's length from the government. They have acted in absolute contradiction to constitutional law and English common law. They have acted as agents of the state's oppression. And there's not a single person that has been able to identify any actual threat to the government. If this government doesn't fall because of this, I'm extremely worried for the Dominion of Canada. The Trudeau family repeatedly has put us into a place where one is forced to say that every bad idea is French. Thank you for listening. There's some things to think and pray about, and I hope that my Quebecois friends who know that these things are true won't find my assertions too offensive.